I was working to death to fund my daughter's college, and I found out that she dropped out and spent my money on partying. She was crying when I exposed her fake rich girl act in front of her VIP friends. I drove trucks for 18 years after my wife died, saving everything for Chloe's education. She got into engineering school at 22 after taking a gap year to find herself. I was so proud. Finally, my baby girl was getting the degree I never could. Every month she called, needing more money. Books were expensive, lab fees were overwhelming, and housing near campus was prohibitively expensive. I picked up extra routes, worked Sundays, and sold my motorcycle. "Dad, I need another $1,500 for this semester's materials," she'd say. "Engineering supplies are ridiculous." I'd transfer it immediately. My sister Rita kept telling me I was sending too much. $8,000 a month for college, even with housing? But Chloe explained everything. Special software licenses, mandatory field trips, and professional development workshops. It all made sense. Thursday morning, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. "Is this Chloe Mason's father?" the woman asked. "Yes, is everything okay?" "This is Linda from University Registration. Your daughter hasn't been enrolled here for over a year. She has an outstanding balance of $12,000 from when she dropped out last October. We've been trying to reach her." My hands went numb. "That's impossible. I pay her tuition every month." "Sir, she hasn't been our student since October 2023. She failed every class her first semester and didn't return." I hung up and called Chloe. No answer. I texted. Nothing. I was supposed to drive a route to Phoenix, but instead, I drove 3 hours to her college town. The address she gave me for her apartment was a shabby complex behind a liquor store. I knocked on Unit 204. A guy with face tattoos answered. "Yeah? I'm looking for Chloe Mason." "Chloe? She's at Dante's probably. Or Revolution. Depends on what day it is." "What's Dante's?" He laughed. "The club on 5th. She's there like every night. VIP section usually. Her dad pays for everything. Must be loaded." I found Dante's. 11 in the morning, and there were still people stumbling out from the night before. The bouncer recognized Chloe's picture immediately. "Party princess?" "Yeah, she runs through here 5 nights a week, drops serious cash, bottles, tables, the works." I waited in my truck until 9 that night, watched her walk up in a dress that cost more than I made in a week. Designer shoes, designer bag, laughing with a group of people who looked like they'd never worked a day in their lives. I followed them in. The music was deafening. I found her in VIP, champagne bottles covering the table, everyone recording themselves on phones. She was pouring drinks, shouting something about her dad being rich. I walked straight through the rope. "Chloe." She turned, champagne glass halfway to her lips. The color drained from her face. "Dad? What are you doing here? I know you're not in school." Her friends all stared. Someone whispered, "That's her rich dad?" "Can we talk about this at home?" she said, trying to pull me aside. "You've been lying for a year. Taking my money while failing out. Dad, please, not here. You told me you needed $1,500 for engineering supplies last week. I can explain everything tomorrow." "No, now." One of her friends, some guy in a silk shirt, laughed. "This is the trucking mogul? Doesn't look that rich to me." "Shut up, Brandon," Chloe hissed. "Trucking mogul?" I asked. "You told them I own a trucking company?" Brandon smirked. "She said you had a whole fleet, that you were paying her to get business experience before she takes over." "I drive trucks," I said loudly. "I don't own anything. I work 70 hours a week to send her money for fake college." The VIP section went quiet. Someone lowered their phone. "Chloe said she was getting her MBA, a girl whispered. "She said her trust fund required her to graduate." "There's no trust fund," I said. "There's no MBA. There's nothing but me destroying my body to pay for this." I gestured at the bottles. "How much is all this?" Chloe's eyes were filling with tears. "Dad, please." The server appeared with a tablet. "Current tab is 3,200. Will you be closing out? 3,200. For 1 night." I looked at my daughter. "You spent more tonight than I make in 2 weeks." "I was going to pay you back," she said. "When I figured things out, I was going to go back to school." "With what money?" "I don't know. Something. I just needed time." "You've had a year," I said. "I can't keep living with my roommates," she said, voice getting desperate. "They're losers. And this apartment is gross, and I can't work minimum wage jobs. I'm supposed to be more than that." "More than what? More than me?" She didn't answer. That was enough. "The money stops now," I said. She looked at me with rage I've never seen before. I turned and walked through the VIP section without looking back. The bouncer didn't stop me this time. The cold air hit my face when I pushed through the doors and my hands were still shaking. I got to my truck and sat there for a minute, gripping the steering wheel. The engine started on the 3rd try. I drove out of the parking lot and didn't look in the rearview mirror. The highway stretched out empty and dark for 3 hours. I checked into a motel around midnight, one of those cheap places with stained carpet and a TV that only got 5 channels. I couldn't sleep. I sat on the bed with my phone calculator, going through every transfer I'd made since October last year. $1,500 here, $2,200 there, $8,000 every month like clockwork. The numbers kept adding up. By 4 in the morning, I'd gone through 13 months of payments. My eyes hurt from staring at the screen. The sun came up around 6 and I still hadn't slept. I called my bank when they opened at 8. The representative sounded cheerful and asked how she could help. I told her I needed to cancel an automatic transfer. She asked which one. I gave her Chloe's account information. She pulled it up and confirmed the monthly amount of $8,000. I said yes, cancel it permanently. She asked if everything was okay with the account. My throat got tight. I managed to say my daughter had been lying to me for over a year about being in the school. There was silence on the line. She said she was sorry and processed the cancellation. The whole call took maybe 4 minutes. I texted Rita after I hung up. Just wrote what happened, the university call, finding Chloe at the nightclub, everything. She called me back within 10 minutes. Her voice was tight with anger. She said she was coming over and to stay put. I drove home. It took me 3 hours because I had to pull over twice when my hands started shaking too bad to steer. Rita's car was already in my driveway when I got there. She had grocery bags in both arms and a thermos of coffee. We went inside and she unpacked food I didn't remember asking for. Bread, eggs, soup, things that would keep. She poured coffee and sat across from me at the kitchen table. I pulled out my phone and showed her the bank app. She scrolled through the transfers, her face getting harder with each swipe. I had printed statements too, kept them in a folder because I liked having paper records. We spread them across the table. Every month, $8,000. Sometimes more when Chloe called with emergencies. Rita pulled out a calculator and started adding. Her pen moved down the columns. I watched her face change when she got to the total. She wrote the number on a piece of paper and slid it across to me. $104,000. I stared at it. The number didn't seem real. Rita's hand was over her mouth. I got up and walked to the bathroom. My stomach turned over and I threw up everything I'd eaten in the past day, which wasn't much. I could hear Rita moving around in the kitchen, putting things away. When I came back, she'd made me toast. I couldn't eat it. My phone started buzzing around noon, text after text from Chloe. The first ones were angry, demanding to know why the transfer didn't go through. She had rent due. She had bills. What was I doing? Then they got panicked. She needed that money. I couldn't just stop without warning. How was she supposed to pay for anything? Then accusations. I was abandoning her. I was being cruel. I didn't care about her life. I put the phone face down on the table. Rita picked it up and read through them. She didn't say anything, just set it back down. The phone kept buzzing every few minutes. I didn't respond to any of them. By evening, the texts stopped. My voicemail notification popped up. I put it on speaker. Chloe's voice came through, crying and broken. She said she'd made mistakes. She knew she'd messed up. But she could fix everything if I'd just give her one more chance. She'd go back to the school for real this time. She'd get a job. She'd pay me back. Her voice got more desperate as she talked. Please, Dad. Please don't do this. Please. The voicemail ended. I looked at Rita. She was watching me with sad eyes. I remembered Chloe's face at that table, surrounded by bottles that cost more than I made in 2 weeks. The designer dress. The lies about me owning a trucking company. Rita stayed through the weekend. We didn't talk much about Chloe. She made meals and we watched TV and she reminded me that Chloe was 23 years old. Not a child. An adult who'd made adult choices. She said if I kept sending money, I'd just be teaching her that lying worked, that she could manipulate me whenever she needed cash. I knew she was right. It didn't make it hurt less. Monday morning, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. A man's voice introduced himself as Coleman Shaw, manager at Dante's. He said Chloe had been in over the weekend trying to run up tabs under my name. He wanted to verify I wasn't covering her charges anymore. I told him firmly I wasn't responsible for anything she ordered. He thanked me for the heads up and said he'd make sure his staff knew. I went back to work Tuesday. Picked up a route to Seattle, 10 hours of driving. The truck felt familiar and safe. The highway stretched out, and I didn't have to think about anything except the road. At a rest stop outside Portland, another trucker asked if I was okay. I must have looked terrible. I said I was fine and bought bad coffee from a vending machine. I realized I hadn't really slept in 4 days. My eyes felt like sandpaper. Wednesday afternoon, my phone rang again. Unknown number. A guy's voice said he was Danny, Chloe's roommate. He said Chloe hadn't left the apartment in days. She'd been crying nonstop. He was worried about her, but he also needed to know if she could pay her share of rent this month because he couldn't cover both portions. I told him I didn't know what Chloe's money situation was anymore. I wasn't sending anything. He should probably look for a new roommate. Danny went quiet on the other end of the line. Then he said he figured as much after what happened at Dante's. He felt bad for me. I thanked him and hung up. The conversation left me feeling empty. Even her roommate knew the whole thing was a mess. Rita called me Thursday evening. She'd gotten a Facebook message from Madison Westbrook, one of Chloe's VIP friends. Madison wanted to know if what happened at the club was real or some kind of mix-up. Rita asked if I wanted her to respond. I told her to ignore it. Chloe's social life wasn't my problem anymore. Whatever happened with her friends were between them. Rita agreed and said she'd delete the message without responding. By Sunday, my phone stopped buzzing every few minutes. The constant texts from Chloe just stopped. The quiet felt worse than all the messages. I kept picking up my phone to check if it was working. I'd open my texts and stare at the empty screen. No new messages. Nothing. I found myself waiting for the next angry text or desperate voicemail. When nothing came, I felt this weird panic in my chest. Like something was wrong because she wasn't reaching out. I knew that was stupid. The silence was what I wanted. What I needed. But it still felt wrong somehow. Monday morning, I called my bank and asked to meet with someone about my accounts. They set me up with an advisor named Sarah for Tuesday afternoon. I drove to the bank after finishing a morning route. Sarah was maybe 40, professional looking, with glasses and a kind smile. She pulled up my accounts on her computer and started reviewing the numbers. Her face stayed neutral, but I could see her eyes moving across the screen, taking in all those transfers to Chloe, all that money going out month after month. Sarah turned her monitor so I could see. She walked me through my savings account first. $8,000 left. That was it. I'd had over $60,000 in there 2 years ago. She pulled up my retirement account next. The number was smaller than it should be for someone my age. A lot smaller. She said it gently, like she was trying not to make me feel worse than I already did. I'd pulled money from retirement twice to cover Chloe's bigger requests. The early withdrawal penalties had cost me thousands more. Sarah asked if I'd been planning to retire soon. I laughed. It came out bitter and harsh. I'd been planning to work 5 more years, I told her. Then scale back to part-time. Maybe do local routes only. Spend time with family. Travel a little. Now I'd probably need to work another decade to rebuild what I lost. Maybe longer. Sarah looked at me with sympathy, but she couldn't offer any magic fixes. The money was gone. I'd have to earn it back the same way I'd earned it the first time. One route at a time. One paycheck at a time. Rita came over Wednesday night with a notebook and her laptop. She said we were going to make a budget. A real one. I showed her my bills and my pay stubs. We went through everything. Rita cut out my streaming services. All 3 of them. I barely watched them anyway. She told me to start bringing lunch to work instead of buying it at truck stops. That would save maybe $40 a week. We looked at my route schedule and Rita suggested I pick up an extra Saturday route. The company was always looking for weekend drivers. That would add another $600 a month. Rita made a spreadsheet with all my expenses in one column and my income in the other. She highlighted the difference in green. That was what I could save each month if I stuck to the budget. $1,100. It wasn't much compared to what I'd lost. But it was a start. She printed out the budget and stuck it on my fridge with a magnet. Then she hugged me and told me I'd get through this. I wanted to believe her. 2 weeks and 3 days after the nightclub, I got a certified letter. Had to sign for it at the post office. The return address was Chloe's apartment complex. I opened it in my truck. The letter said Chloe was evicted for not paying rent. They were contacting me because I was listed as her emergency contact. They wanted to know if I'd cover the back rent she owed, 3 months' worth. The total came to $6,400. I read the letter twice. Chloe had stopped paying rent 4 months ago. 4 months. She'd been using my money for other things instead. The clubs, the clothes, the bottles. Everything except what she was supposed to pay for. I drove home and found a pen. Wrote, "Return to sender" across the envelope in big letters. Added, "Not responsible" underneath. Put it back in my mailbox with the flag up. Saturday morning, my phone buzzed with a text from Danny. He'd sent a photo. An eviction notice taped to their apartment door. Orange paper. Official looking. Danny's message said he was moving out that weekend. Chloe had until the end of the month to get her stuff out. He added that she'd been selling her designer clothes and bags online, trying to raise money, but it wasn't nearly enough to cover what she owed the complex. I was driving a route to Sacramento the following Tuesday. The highway took me right past the university. I saw the exit sign and something made me pull off. I drove to campus and parked near the administration building. Found my way to the registrar's office. Linda was there behind the counter. She recognized me immediately, asked if everything was okay. I told her I wanted to pay Chloe's outstanding balance, the $12,000 she owed from dropping out. Linda looked surprised. She pulled up Chloe's account and confirmed the amount. I handed over my credit card. Watched her process the payment. The receipt printed out and she passed it across the counter. I folded it and put it in my wallet. Linda said Chloe could re-enroll now if she wanted. The balance was clear. I nodded but didn't say anything about that. I told Linda this was the last money I'd ever send for anything related to my daughter's education. She nodded like she understood. I walked back to my truck and sat there for a few minutes before pulling back onto the highway. Linda said something about Chloe being able to come back now that the balance was paid, how she'd just need to retake the classes she failed. I didn't respond to that. Chloe had shown zero interest in actually going back to the school. I got back in my truck and merged onto the highway toward Sacramento. 3 weeks passed. I picked up extra Saturday routes and stuck to Rita's budget. My phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon while I was unloading in Fresno. Number I didn't recognize. I answered anyway. The voice on the other end was angry and loud. It took me a second to place it as Brandon, the silk shirt guy from the nightclub. He was yelling about how I embarrassed Chloe and ruined her reputation, how I made her look like a liar in front of everyone. I let him go for maybe 30 seconds. Then I hung up, blocked the number immediately. Rita called me that evening while I was eating dinner at a truck stop. She'd been looking at Madison's social media because she wanted to see what Chloe's friends were saying. Madison had been posting a lot. Vague stuff about fake friends and people who lie about their lives. Rita said it was clearly about Chloe. The whole VIP crowd had apparently cut her off completely. Nobody wanted to be associated with the girl whose rich dad turned out to be a regular truck driver. The social fallout sounded brutal based on what Rita was reading to me. I felt a tiny bit bad for Chloe. Then I remembered the $3,200 bar tab. 2 days later, my phone rang again. Different number. A woman's voice asked if I was Roy Hudson. I said yes. She identified herself as calling from a credit card company. She had some questions about recent charges made at various nightclubs and restaurants in the college town. Charges made in my name. My hands went cold on the steering wheel. I pulled over at the next exit. The woman listed off dates and amounts. Dante's nightclub, Revolution, someplace called Azure, a fancy restaurant called the Meridian, all in the past 6 months, all adding up to thousands of dollars. I told her I never applied for any credit card with her company. She was quiet for a second. Then she said the application had my social security number and address. Someone had used my information as a co-signer. My stomach felt sick. Chloe. She asked if I wanted to file a fraud report. I said yes. She transferred me to their fraud department. I spent 40 minutes on the phone while sitting in a parking lot off Interstate 5. They started an investigation. Told me to check my credit report for other accounts I didn't recognize. I hung up and immediately pulled my credit report on my phone. 3 cards I'd never seen before, all opened in the past 8 months, all with my information, all with balances. I called the other 2 companies. Same story. Someone had used my social security number and personal details to open accounts. The fraud investigators asked me if I knew who might have access to my information. I had to say it was probably my daughter. They were professional about it, but I could hear the surprise in their voices. The investigation took a week. They sent me statements showing every charge. Nightclubs mostly. Bottle service, VIP tables, some designer clothing stores, a few expensive dinners. The total across all 3 cards came to $22,000. $22,000 on top of the $104,000 I'd already sent her. I filed police reports for identity theft. 3 separate reports for 3 separate cards. The credit card company said they'd investigate and likely forgive the debt since it was fraud. But I needed the police reports for documentation. A detective called me the following Monday. He said he'd received my identity theft reports and wanted to ask some questions. I explained everything. The fake college, the year of lies, the money I'd sent, the confrontation at the nightclub, now the credit cards. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said he was sorry I was going through this. But he explained that even though Chloe was my daughter, using my information without permission was still fraud. Identity theft. I had the right to press charges if I wanted. The words hung there. Press charges. Against my own daughter. He asked if I wanted to move forward with prosecution. I told him I needed time to think. He said that was fine. He'd give me 2 weeks to decide. Then he'd need an answer about whether I wanted to pursue criminal charges. I called Rita after I hung up. Told her everything. She was quiet at first. Then she said I should press charges. That Chloe needed to face real consequences for what she'd done. That maybe a criminal record would finally teach her something. I sat in my truck and thought about Chloe with a criminal record. Thought about her trying to get jobs with a fraud conviction. Thought about her in court. Maybe jail. It made me feel sick. But so did everything else she'd done. 4 weeks after the nightclub confrontation, my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer. Something made me pick up. Chloe's voice was on the other end. It sounded different, smaller, quieter. She asked if we could meet in person. Said she needed to talk to me, that she'd lost her apartment and didn't know what to do. I asked why I should help her after everything. She didn't have a good answer. Just said please. I agreed to meet at a diner near the college town. Neutral ground, not her place or mine. We set a time for Thursday afternoon. I drove down there after finishing a morning route, got to the diner 15 minutes early, ordered coffee and waited. Chloe walked in right on time. I barely recognized her. She was wearing jeans and a plain t-shirt. No design or anything. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. No makeup. She looked tired. She slid into the booth across from me. Didn't say anything at first. Just sat there twisting a napkin in her hands. Then she started talking. Said she was sorry. That she'd panicked after failing out. That the lie just grew bigger and bigger. That she thought she could eventually go back to the school and make it all true. That she'd fix everything before I found out. She talked about how scared she was to tell me she'd failed. how she didn't want to disappoint me, how she got caught up in the nightclub scene and couldn't figure out how to stop. I listened, didn't interrupt, watched her hands destroy that napkin. She looked different from the girl pouring champagne in VIP 4 weeks ago. She looked like someone who'd been living in the real world for the first time in a year. She kept talking, her hands still working that napkin into shreds. She told me she'd been crashing on Danny's couch at his new place for the past 3 weeks since her apartment complex kicked her out. She got a job at a coffee shop near campus, making $9 an hour. She was working 40 hours a week, which she said was the hardest thing she'd ever done in her life. She'd been trying to sell all the designer clothes and bags and shoes online, but most of it only brought in a fraction of what she'd paid. The coffee shop job meant she was on her feet all day, dealing with rude customers, cleaning up spills, memorizing drink orders. Her voice got quieter when she talked about how sore her legs were after shifts, how she came back to Danny's couch too tired to do anything but sleep. I watched her face as she described this new reality, looking for signs that she was performing again, but she just looked exhausted. I waited until she finished talking, then asked her directly about the credit cards. Her face changed immediately. The tears started before she even opened her mouth. She put her head in her hands and started crying for real this time. Not the angry tears from the nightclub, but something that looked like actual shame. She admitted between sobs that she'd opened 3 credit cards using my information because she was too embarrassed to keep asking me for money directly. She said she'd planned to pay them all off once she figured things out, once she got her life together and could handle it. But the interest kept adding up and she just stopped opening the statements. She'd been ignoring the calls from the credit card companies for months. I sat there watching my daughter fall apart across the diner table, and I didn't reach out to comfort her. She looked up at me with red eyes and mascara running down her face, and she begged me not to press charges. She said a fraud conviction would destroy any chance she had of getting her life together or going back to the school someday. She kept saying please over and over, her voice breaking. I told her honestly that I hadn't decided yet about the charges. I said my decision would depend on whether she showed me real change, not just words and promises. She started to interrupt, to promise she would change, but I held up my hand. I laid out exactly what I needed to see if she wanted any chance of rebuilding our relationship. She needed to keep that coffee shop job for at least 6 months straight, no quitting when it got hard. She needed to enroll in community college part-time and actually attend the classes. She needed to set up a real payment plan with the credit card companies for the debt, even if it took years to pay off. Chloe agreed to everything immediately, nodding frantically, saying yes to each condition before I even finished explaining it. That instant agreement made me more skeptical, not less, because it felt too easy. I told her I wasn't sending any more money, not a single dollar. I wasn't co-signing anything, not loans or apartments or credit cards. I wasn't bailing her out of any more problems she created. She needed to prove through her actions that she was serious about changing, not just tell me what I wanted to hear. We left the diner about an hour after we'd sat down, and the whole drive home I felt like I'd been hit by a truck. My body ached from the emotional exhaustion of sitting across from my daughter and setting those boundaries. When I got back to my place, Rita was waiting because I'd texted her I was meeting Chloe. She asked how it went, and I told her the truth, which was that I had no idea if Chloe would actually follow through or if this was just another manipulation to get back in my good graces. Rita made me coffee, and we sat at my kitchen table going over everything Chloe had said. The next week, my phone buzzed with a text from Chloe. It was a photo of a paycheck stub from the coffee shop, showing $800 for 2 weeks of work after taxes were taken out. She added a message saying she'd never realized how hard it was to actually earn money before, and now she understood why I was always so tired when I came home from Roots. I stared at that photo for a long time before responding. I typed back just 2 words. Good job. Nothing else. No praise or encouragement or softening of my position. Rita saw the text exchange when she stopped by later and told me not to let one paycheck convince me that everything was fixed. She reminded me that real change took months of steady behavior, not a couple of weeks of effort. 5 weeks after our meeting at the diner, the detective called my cell while I was on a route near the state border. He asked if I'd made a decision about pressing charges for the identity theft and credit card fraud. I told him I wanted to wait another month to see if Chloe actually kept her job and enrolled in community college like she'd promised. He was quiet for a second, then said he could extend the timeline and would check back with me in 4 weeks. 2 days after that call, Chloe sent me a screenshot of her community college enrollment confirmation. It showed she was registered for 2 classes starting in 3 weeks, basic math and English composition. The classes were on Tuesdays and Thursdays in the evening, so she could still work her coffee shop shifts during the day. She was using financial aid to cover the costs since she couldn't afford to pay out of pocket, and the confirmation showed her aid had been approved. I stared at the enrollment confirmation on my phone screen for a long time before typing back. The proof was right there showing she'd actually registered for classes, but I couldn't let myself get too hopeful yet. I typed out a response, keeping it simple and neutral. Glad you're taking steps forward. That was it. Nothing more. No encouragement or praise that might make her think we were suddenly okay again. I hit send and put my phone down, feeling the weight of trying to balance support with boundaries. Rita called that evening asking how I was doing, and I told her about the enrollment confirmation. She reminded me that registering for classes and actually attending them were two different things, which I already knew but needed to hear anyway. The next few weeks passed with me back on my roots, picking up extra shifts on Saturdays to rebuild my savings account. My phone stayed quiet, except for the occasional text from Chloe about her coffee shop schedule or some detail about her classes starting soon. 6 weeks after she'd started working at the coffee shop, my phone rang while I was eating lunch at a rest stop outside of Portland. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize with the same area code as the college town. I answered, and a woman's voice said she was calling from the coffee shop where Chloe worked. My first thought was that something had happened, or Chloe had quit already. The woman explained she was the manager, and Chloe had listed me as an emergency contact on her apartment application. She needed to verify Chloe's employment and wanted to know if she was a reliable employee. I confirmed Chloe worked there and had been there about 6 weeks as far as I knew. The manager surprised me by saying Chloe was actually one of her best employees, always showed up on time, never called in sick, and worked hard during her shifts. I thanked her for the information and hung up feeling a strange mix of emotions I couldn't quite identify. 2 days later, Chloe texted me a screenshot of an apartment approval letter. The studio apartment cost $500 a month, which she said would take almost all her paycheck after taxes, but it was hers, and she'd earned it herself. She added 3 exclamation points at the end of the message, the first time I'd seen her express genuine excitement about something in months. I looked at that text, sitting in my truck before my next route, and felt something shift slightly inside me. Not forgiveness exactly, but maybe the smallest crack in the protective wall I'd built up. I texted back a simple thumbs-up emoji and put my phone away. Rita came over the following Sunday with groceries and her laptop to help me review my bank statements. We sat at my kitchen table going through every account, adding up what I'd managed to save since I stopped sending Chloe money 2 months ago. Rita pointed at the savings account balance showing $4,000. It wasn't much compared to what I'd lost, but it was real progress. She pulled up a retirement calculator on her laptop, and we plugged in my current age, income, and savings rate. The numbers showed I could potentially retire at 67 if I kept saving at this pace and didn't have any major expenses. That was better than I'd feared after seeing how depleted my accounts had gotten. We talked about my budget, and Rita suggested I could pick up one less Saturday route per month to give myself a break without hurting my savings goals too much. 7 weeks after the diner meeting with Chloe, I got a call from a blocked number while I was loading my truck for an early morning route. A man's voice introduced himself as a professor from the community college calling about Chloe Mason. My chest tightened immediately, thinking she'd already dropped out or gotten in trouble. He said Chloe had missed class twice in the past week, and he was calling her emergency contacts to check if everything was okay. I told him I'd talk to her and find out what was going on, then ended the call and immediately texted Chloe asking why she was missing classes. She called me back within 5 minutes, sounding stressed and tired. She explained she'd had to cover extra shifts at the coffee shop because another employee quit and her manager needed help. She was working 50 hours some weeks trying to make sure she could pay rent on time. I felt frustration rising because this was exactly what I'd worried about, her trying to do too much and failing at everything. We talked for 20 minutes about how she couldn't keep missing classes or she'd fail again, but she couldn't afford to work less either. I suggested maybe she needed to look into student loans to reduce her work hours so she could actually focus on the school. Chloe got quiet on the other end of the phone. She said she was terrified of taking on any debt after what happened with the credit cards. I understood her fear, but explained that small federal student loans for community college were completely different from credit card fraud and living beyond your means. These loans would help her invest in education that could actually lead to better income later. She said she'd think about it, and we ended the call with me feeling uncertain if I'd helped or just added more pressure. Over the next week, I sent Chloe some links to federal student loan information and community college financial aid resources. I made it clear I wasn't co-signing anything, and she'd have to handle this herself, but I could at least point her toward legitimate options. She texted back thanking me and said she had an appointment with a financial aid counselor at the college. A week later, she sent me a screenshot showing she'd been approved for a small federal loan that would cover some of her tuition and let her cut back to 30 hours a week at the coffee shop. The loan amount was only about $3,000 for the semester, which seemed manageable compared to the massive debt she'd racked up before. 8 weeks into her new arrangement with reduced work hours, Chloe texted me a photo of her first test grades. English composition B, Math C. The message she sent with it said she couldn't believe she'd actually earned these grades by studying and doing the work instead of cheating or giving up. I stared at those grades, remembering when she was in elementary school and would bring home report cards. We used to go get ice cream to celebrate good grades, just the two of us after her mom died. I didn't suggest ice cream this time, but I did text back telling her I was proud of her effort. That same week, the detective called asking if I'd made a final decision about pressing charges for the identity theft and credit card fraud. I told him about everything Chloe had been doing over the past 2 months, the job she'd kept, the apartment she'd gotten, the classes she was attending and passing. He listened without interrupting, then asked if I was sure about not pressing charges. I said yes, I was sure, because Chloe was finally making real changes, and a criminal record would destroy any progress she'd made. The detective said he understood and would close the case on his end. He mentioned the credit card companies would likely pursue their own civil actions for the debt. 2 days later, I got letters from all 3 credit card companies offering settlement arrangements. The settlements would garnish a portion of Chloe's paychecks for the next 3 years to pay back about 60% of what she'd charged. It wasn't ideal, but it felt like appropriate consequences, real financial pain she'd have to deal with for years without completely destroying her future. I signed the settlement agreements and sent them back. Rita called me the following Saturday and asked if I'd come to Sunday dinner at her house the next day. Then she added that she'd invited Chloe too. I was quiet for a moment, processing what that meant. The 3 of us sitting down together for the first time since the nightclub confrontation. Rita said it didn't have to be a big thing, just dinner, and we could all use some normal family time. I agreed, even though my stomach felt tight thinking about it. Sunday afternoon, I drove to Rita's house and saw Chloe's beat-up Honda already parked in the driveway. I sat in my truck for a minute before going inside. Rita answered the door and hugged me, then led me to the kitchen where Chloe was helping set the table. Chloe looked up when I walked in and gave a small, nervous smile. We said hello to each other, and I sat down at the table while Rita finished cooking. The first 30 minutes were awkward with long silences and careful conversation about safe topics like the weather and Rita's job. But then Rita started telling a story about her own college days when she'd failed a class and been too scared to tell our parents. She described hiding the grade report and forging a new one, getting caught when the school mailed home the real grades. We all laughed at her dramatic retelling of our dad's reaction. The tension broke slightly, and we kept talking through the rest of dinner, not about anything deep or serious, just normal family conversation. When I left that evening, I hugged Chloe briefly before getting in my truck. It wasn't forgiveness and it wasn't everything being fixed, but it was something, a small step toward whatever our relationship would become now. 2 weeks later, I had a route that took me through the college town, and I texted Chloe asking if I could see her apartment. She responded immediately with her address and said she'd be home after her shift ended at 3. I pulled up to a small complex on the edge of town, nothing fancy but clean and maintained, and found her unit on the 2nd floor. Chloe answered wearing her coffee shop uniform, hair pulled back, and she looked tired but smiled when she saw me. The studio was maybe 300 square feet total, one room with a tiny kitchen area and a bathroom barely big enough to turn around in. She'd furnished it with things from thrift stores and yard sales, a small couch that didn't match the coffee table, a bed in the corner with a quilt I recognized from our old house, and a desk under the window where textbooks were stacked next to her laptop. Everything was clean and organized, dishes washed and put away, laundry folded on a chair. I walked around slowly, taking it all in, and noticed she'd hung a few photos on the wall, pictures of her and Rita, one of me from years ago standing next to my truck. The place was nothing like the image she'd tried to project at Dante's, no designer anything, no expensive bottles, just a young woman living within her means and making it work. I told her the apartment looked good and she seemed relieved, explaining how she'd found most of the furniture for free on community boards and fixed up what needed repairs. When I left an hour later, driving back to my route, I felt something I hadn't felt in months, a small flicker of pride that maybe she was actually changing. 3 months had passed since I walked out of that nightclub and cut off the money. I woke up one morning in early November and realized I'd slept through the entire night without waking up at 2 in the morning, worried about bills or transfers, or whether Chloe was lying to me about something new. The constant pressure that had lived in my chest for over a year was gone, replaced by something lighter, a cautious hope that felt fragile but real. I didn't trust it completely because I'd been fooled before, but I couldn't deny that my body felt different, less tense, less exhausted all the time. The worry about funding her fake education had consumed me, made every route feel heavier, every paycheck feel insufficient, and now that weight was gone. I still thought about Chloe constantly, wondered how she was doing, worried that she'd slip back into old patterns. But it was different now because I wasn't enabling her anymore, and that made the worry feel manageable instead of crushing. The week before Thanksgiving, Chloe called and asked if she could come to Rita's house for dinner. I told her yes, but added that I expected her to contribute something she made herself, not something bought from a store. She was quiet for a moment, then agreed and said she'd figure something out. Thanksgiving Day arrived and I drove to Rita's house early to help her cook, and around 2 in the afternoon, Chloe's car pulled into the driveway. She got out carrying a pie plate covered with foil, walking carefully up the steps, and when she came inside, Rita hugged her immediately. Chloe set the pie on the counter and pulled back the foil to reveal a pumpkin pie that was slightly lopsided, the crust a bit darker on one side than the other, but clearly homemade. She explained she'd never made a pie before and had to watch 3 different videos to figure out the crust, and her apartment oven ran hot, so she'd burned the edge slightly. But she'd done it herself like I asked. Rita cut into it after dinner, and the filling was smooth and spiced right, tasting better than any store-bought pie, and I watched Chloe's face light up when Rita told her it was delicious. During dinner, after we'd finished eating and were sitting around Rita's table with coffee, Chloe put down her cup and looked at both me and Rita. She said she needed to apologize for everything, not the desperate apologies from before when she was panicking about money, but a real acknowledgement of how her lies had hurt us and damaged our trust. She talked about how she'd been ashamed after failing out of school, and instead of asking for help, she'd built this elaborate fiction, spending my money to create a fake life that made her feel important. She said she'd told herself she was going to fix it eventually, go back to the school and make the lies true, but that was just another lie to avoid facing what she'd done. Chloe looked at Rita and apologized for making her doubt her own instincts when Rita had questioned the money, and she looked at me and apologized for taking advantage of how much I loved her and wanted her to succeed. She didn't make excuses about being young or scared or confused, didn't ask us to forgive her or tell her it was okay, just owned what she'd done and said she was working every day to become someone we could trust again. Rita reached across the table and squeezed Chloe's hand, and I nodded because I didn't trust my voice right then. 4 months after the confrontation at Dante's, my phone buzzed with a text from Chloe while I was unloading at a warehouse in Portland. She'd sent a screenshot of her final grades from community college, a B in English and a B- in math, along with her spring semester registration showing 3 classes. Below that, she'd added that the coffee shop had promoted her to shift supervisor with a raise to $11 an hour, and she'd be working 30 hours a week while taking classes. I stood there in the warehouse looking at my phone, reading the message 3 times, and felt that cautious hope grow a little stronger. The grades weren't perfect, but they were honest, earned through actual work and attendance, and the promotion meant her manager trusted her enough to give her responsibility. I texted back congratulations and told her to keep it up, keeping my response brief but genuine. After that, Chloe and I started having weekly phone calls on Sunday evenings when I was usually home between routes. We'd talk for 20 or 30 minutes about normal things, how her classes were going, which routes I'd driven that week, what Rita was up to, nothing deep or emotional. She'd tell me about difficult customers at the coffee shop or a test she'd studied hard for, and I'd tell her about traffic or weather or other truckers I'd met at rest stops. The conversations were shorter than they used to be when she'd call asking for money, and they stayed on the surface instead of getting into serious topics, but they were honest now, and that mattered more than the closeness we'd had before when everything was built on lies. I could hear the difference in her voice, less performance, less trying to convince me of something, just a daughter talking to her father about regular life. One Sunday in late January, Chloe mentioned during our call that Sloan Diamond had reached out to her through social media. Sloan had been in the engineering program with Chloe before she dropped out, and apparently Sloan had heard through someone that Chloe was back in the school at community college. They'd met for coffee, and Sloan had offered to help tutor Chloe in math if she decided to work toward transferring back to a 4-year program eventually. Chloe sounded surprised that Sloan still wanted to be friends after everything that had happened. And I could hear hope in her voice when she talked about maybe going back to engineering someday if she could get her grades up and prove she was serious this time. 5 months after everything fell apart, I met with my bank advisor again to review my financial situation. She pulled up my accounts and went through the numbers, showing me that I'd managed to save $11,000 since I stopped sending money to Chloe and had increased my retirement contributions back to where they should be. She calculated that if I maintained this pace and kept working, I'd be on track to retire at 67, maybe 68, which was later than I'd originally hoped, but better than I'd feared after seeing how depleted everything had gotten. The advisor seemed pleased with my progress and said I'd done a good job of rebuilding after a difficult situation, and I left her office feeling like maybe I hadn't completely destroyed my future trying to fund Chloe's lies. A few days later, Chloe sent me a detailed payment plan she'd created on a spreadsheet, showing how she could pay me back $50 a month from her paychecks over the next 5 years for the credit card debt. The spreadsheet had columns for payment dates and running balances, clearly showing she'd put real thought into it. I called her instead of texting back and told her I appreciated the gesture, and it showed she was taking responsibility. But she needed to focus on paying the credit card companies first, since those were legal obligations with consequences if she didn't pay. I said we could discuss repayment to me later, after she'd handled the official debts, because I didn't want her spreading herself too thin and failing at everything. She sounded disappointed, but agreed that made sense. That weekend, I stopped by Rita's house and we sat on her back porch drinking coffee while the sun went down. Rita told me she was proud of how I'd handled everything with Chloe, setting clear boundaries while still leaving the door open for her to earn back trust through actions instead of words. I admitted I still struggled with guilt sometimes, wondering if I'd been too harsh or if I should have given her more chances before cutting her off completely. Rita shook her head and said enabling Chloe would have been worse for both of us, that I'd shown her real love by forcing her to face consequences and learn to stand on her own instead of rescuing her from every problem. She said the Chloe who made that pie and worked 40-hour weeks at a coffee shop was more real than the Chloe who'd spent $3,200 in one night at a nightclub. and I'd given her the chance to become that person by refusing to fund the fake version anymore. 6 months passed since that conversation with Rita, and Chloe called me one Thursday evening, asking if I wanted to come over for dinner at her place. I drove to her studio apartment Saturday afternoon, finding the building in a quiet neighborhood near the community college campus. She buzzed me in, and I climbed 2 flights of stairs to Unit 308. The apartment was tiny when she opened the door, maybe 400 square feet total, but it was clean and organized in a way that surprised me. She had a small kitchen area with a 2-burner stove, where a pot of water was already boiling for spaghetti. The furniture was all second-hand stuff: a small table with 2 mismatched chairs, a futon couch against one wall, and a desk covered in textbooks and papers near the window. She stirred the pasta while I sat at the table, watching her move around the cramped kitchen with the confidence of someone who'd learned to cook on a budget. The salad she'd made sat in a plastic bowl, just lettuce and tomatoes with some Italian dressing. Nothing fancy. We ate at her second-hand table, the chairs wobbling slightly on the uneven floor, and she told me about her plans to finish 2 years at community college before applying to transfer back to the university for engineering. She talked about the credits she'd need, the GPA requirements for transfer students, and how she'd been meeting with an advisor who helped her map out a realistic timeline. I listened while eating the spaghetti, which was basic but decent, and I could see she'd put real thought into this plan instead of just throwing out vague promises like before. When she paused to take a bite, I asked her directly if she was serious about engineering or if she was just saying that because she thought it was what I wanted to hear. She stopped chewing and looked down at her plate for a long moment, the fork resting in her hand. Then she admitted she didn't know yet, but she was taking a physics class next semester to see if she was really interested or if she was just following my dreams instead of finding her own. Her honesty caught me off guard because the old Chloe would have just told me what I wanted to hear, insisting she loved engineering and always had. After we finished eating, she cleared the plates and pulled out her laptop, opening a spreadsheet she'd created that tracked every dollar she earned and spent. I recognized my own influence in her careful accounting, the way she'd organized it by category with running totals and monthly comparisons. She showed me that she'd paid down $2,000 of the credit card debt, kept her coffee shop job for 6 months straight without missing a shift, and maintained a B average in community college, taking 2 classes while working 40 hours a week. The spreadsheet had entries for rent, utilities, groceries, gas, and a small amount each month for savings, all color-coded and calculated down to the cent. I could see she'd been living on about $1,400 a month after taxes, with almost nothing left over for anything beyond basic expenses. She pointed to the debt payoff column and explained how she'd been putting every extra dollar toward the credit cards, sometimes just $20 or $30 a month, but consistently every single month. I left her apartment around 8 that evening and drove home through the dark, my truck's headlights cutting through the empty highway. The relationship we had now would never be what it was before, and maybe that wasn't entirely bad, I thought, as I passed the exit for my neighborhood. The old relationship was built on my sacrifices and her expectations, while this new one was based on honest communication, boundaries that actually meant something, and Chloe learning to stand on her own 2 feet. We were both different people now than we'd been 6 months ago at that nightclub. And I felt cautiously hopeful that we were building something that could actually last, even if it was less comfortable and required more work from both of us than the easy pattern we'd fallen into before.